This is Tipping Point Radio. I'm Craig Merriweather, and you're listening to Emergence. In today's episode, we're going to focus on the heart, an organ with an amazing influence over our mental lives. We all learned in biology class how our heart pumps our blood throughout our body, and we have been taught that it is only our brain that is in control, while the rest of our body obediently responds to its commands. However, research over the last few decades has shown that the heart has neural and bioelectromagnetic influence upon our brains. There is a profound communication link between the heart and the brain, and incredibly, while messages flow in both directions, surprisingly more information seems to originate from the heart. Research has revealed that the heart even radiates an influence on those around us via electromagnetic fields. Research has also shown the heart to be approximately 60 times greater electrically and up to 5,000 times stronger magnetically than the brain. Dr. Rollin McCraty is the Executive Vice President and Director of Research at HeartMarth, an institute that for over 20 years has conducted research that shows a critical link between emotions, heart function, and cognitive performance. Dr. McCraty has worked with the Institute of HeartMarth since its inception in 1991, and he has developed the organization's research goals and created the Institute's Scientific Advisory Board. Dr. McCraty is an internationally recognized authority on heart rate variability, heart rhythm coherency, and the effects of positive and negative emotions on human psychophysiology. He has authored dozens of research studies, many of which have been published in peer-reviewed journals including the American Journal of Cardiology, Journal of the American College of Cardiology, Stress Medicine, Biological Psychology, and Integrative Psychology and Behavioral Science. Now here's my interview with Dr. Rollin McCraty. Hello, Rollin. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Craig. Thanks. It's great to be here.
Yeah, the HeartMarth research you've been doing is so fascinating to me because when I was in school, it was basically the heart pumped blood, and that was really nice. And eat well, otherwise you might get heart disease, and the brain really controlled everything else. And the research you've been doing and the other researchers at HeartMarth has shown that that actually isn't the case. And I'd love to just kind of open up with maybe some, I don't know if you'd call it basic information, but some of the findings you've been having of just like the heart communicating to the brain. And one of the things we were talking before, I had taken some notes at a lecture you did about a year ago, and one of the things that just blew my mind is that the heart secretes as much oxytocin as the brain. And this is the stuff, at least I didn't learn about in school, and it's mind-blowing that you hear people say follow your heart and listen to your heart, and it might actually be something to that.
Indeed. In fact, kind of at the end of probably the conversation we have, I hope that your listeners come to that conclusion, actually, that, in fact, the central theme of every great major spiritual tradition on earth, from the beginning of recorded history, actually, I have one of my friends is a scholar of these types of things, talks about the heart as the central access point to wisdom, to courage, to the deeper aspects of ourself. So if there's something probably to that, if every single major, tradition, Islam, Buddhism, Christianity, and on the list goes, have that as a central theme. Of course, I'm a scientist, but it's interesting that our research is really starting to confirm some of these basic, very core ideas that have been around for millennia. Now, I can't take all the credit for this because there's a lot of people that have come before me and a lot of other people working on these things as well. I've been able to kind of put a lot of the pieces together, maybe in a way that others haven't. But for example, the fact that this is a fact, and a lot of people are surprised when they hear me say this, but the heart sends far more information through our nervous system to the brain than the other way around. Now, that's been known since the late 1800s. This is anatomy. It's basic anatomy. And this was well known and understood and a major theme in psychology in the late 1800s. And a very famous guy is considered the father of the whole field of psychology. William James talked a lot about this. And then in the 20s, 30s through there, other things started happening, discoveries, and basically people just forgot about this. And I think there's also been kind of a bias in science that, like you were saying, the brain's in control of everything, and we kind of gotten glamored by the brain and what it does. And this is not about, by the way, I'm not trying to say heart versus brain. It's really getting the two working together is my message here. I'm glad I've got a brain and I want it to work well. But as it turns out, what the heart's doing has a major impact on how well our brain works. Now, there were other kind of just a little history here, if I may, Craig. In the late 60s, and especially through the 1970s and early 80s, a lot of research went on to this in my field, which is called psychophysiology, where a particular research group found that the heart, it's pretty fascinating to read through their research publications and back then, because they're talking and writing as if the heart has a mind of its own. And that at that time, this bias had already happened, and the brain's there, and whatever signals go down our nervous system, body just jumps to its tune, right? I mean, that was the prevailing paradigm. But this research group was finding, well, the heart didn't act that way. You could have all these signals coming down from the brain to the heart, but the heart did something else. It made its own decisions and overrode those signals. And not only that, the activity of the heart was affecting our perception, our reaction times, all kinds of things, our emotional experience. And they even coined some terms back then to describe the impact the heart was having on the brain. One of those was called cortical inhibition, and just meaning the cortex. It's really like global effect. So in certain heart activities, our brain was inhibited. We couldn't think as well. Reaction times were slow, and all these types of things. And in other heart states, the term was cortical facilitation. So this created a bit of a stir, and over a number of years, people arguing back and forth, how can this be? And they were eventually proven right and won all kinds of career awards, and it actually became the most famous hypothesis in the field of psychophysiology. That is that the heart had a causal role in modulating brain functions, many brain functions. Now, what they didn't know back then was that within the human heart, it actually has a very complex nervous system, and that spawned a whole new field. It's called neurocardiology, and that's been around quite a while as well, long before I came along. And it was 1991 that the neurocardiology community first kind of publicly stated in academic publications that technically it's called the intrinsic cardiac nervous system, but that nervous system could literally be thought of as a functional brain, and actually nicknamed it the heart brain. So that first appeared in the scientific literature in 1991. So I owe a great deal to the neurocardiology community for all the work they've done on mapping out the anatomy and the function of the heart brain. Because when they don't say this literally, it's not a metaphor. In other words, all these neurons in the heart are very complexly wired together in this distributed network, and the same techniques used in brain neurons have been shown to or proven that these neurons in the heart have short-term memory, long-term memory, neuroplasticity, neurogenesis, all the same things. And as it turns out, it's the nervous system of the heart has neural connections directly to other parts of the body, like our skin, the throat, the lungs, and so on, and it ends up being a major integration center of a lot of things, as is in our what we call the neural axis. So that kind of gives maybe a background there where we kind of come in to play here. I don't know if you want to. I'll pause there for a minute, and if you have any questions or Craig.
No, I think you're going great. No, this is fully I'm fully understanding what you're saying.
Okay, all right. So let me kind of enter where our research started, and this is back in the early 1990s at HeartMarth. So at that time, it's probably good to give a little more background here. There were very few publications in the scientific literature that had anything to do with positive emotions. Thousands and thousands of papers on anxiety and depression and stress and the physiological correlates of that. And you could count all the ones that had something to do with positive emotions on one hand at that time. but we're HeartMarth, right? So we had a particular focus on the heart, but we were also one of the first to really study what you could call the physiological correlates of positive emotions, which not just stress and negative emotions, but what happens in our body when we're actually just feeling good, feeling appreciation, compassion, these kinds of things, not thinking about it. And so that's how we started. And in the beginning, we were looking at all the, like joking to say, three-letter acronym stuff, our EEGs, our brain waves, our skin conductance, muscle tensions, all these types of things. And, of course, the electrocardiogram. And it was through a lot of studies of looking at emotions, both stressful, negative emotions and frustration, things like that, and anxiety, but also the positive emotions that basically make a long story short, it turned out that the rhythmic activity, in other words, that's now called heart rate variability, was the best indicator of a person's emotional state. Whether it was a negative or a positive, we now call them draining or renewing emotions, because negative, positive is not really the right terminology from my perspective. But anyway, the effect they have on us can be negative or positive. But then what also emerged out of that work was that when we're really in that deeper, what we now call kind of heart state, we're really feeling that sincere appreciation, because what a beautiful day it is, those kinds of things, or the love we have for somebody, that the heart literally flips into a completely different mode, the rhythms of the heart. And we call that heart coherence, or a coherent heart rhythm, versus an incoherent heart rhythm. Remember, I mentioned earlier, the heart's sending all this neural information up to the brain. Now, the way you can think, I'm going to back up a little bit here to maybe connect the dots for the listeners. It also used to be thought in medicine that a sign of good health was a steady heart rhythm. In other words, our heart rate, the time between each pair of heartbeats was the same, and that didn't change much unless we did, climb some stairs or did some exercise or things like this. Took a stimulant, whatever. We now know that's completely wrong, that in a healthy person, somebody who's resilient, really able to handle stress, these types of things, their heart rate changes with each and every heartbeat. And that's going on all the time, even when we're asleep. And that's what's called heart rate variability, and it's the beat-to-beat change in heart rate. So in other words, the time between each and every heartbeat is changing somewhat. That's the variability we're talking about. And that has a lot of important health measurements now as well. So we measure how much of it we have, because that's an important indicator of future health. And we have more of it, of this natural variability when we're young, and it gets less as we age. So we can actually measure somebody's heart rate variability and tell within about 2 years how old they are, if they're on a healthy trajectory. But that's just a little background there. But you can think of this variability in addition to just how much of it we have, kind of like Morse code. So we all know that, by Morse code, the longer dashes and dots they call them, but it's basically timing between pulses is what Morse code is. That information is imparted in that. So it's kind of a simplified analogy, but that's basically one of the ways the heart and brain talk to each other, is through these variability patterns. So what we found, to come back to where I was, is that when we're in these positive states, these variability patterns become very sine wave-like. And that a lot of years later, we really understood what all this means. And that it really means that the activity in our higher brain systems and also in our nervous system is much more synchronized. And that's really what underlies good performance, our ability to think clearly, to maintain our composure in the heat of the moment, these kinds of things. So as it turns out, the activity of the heart has a much bigger impact on how well, especially the frontal part of our brain, where we have the capacity to self-regulate ourselves, abstract thinking, foresight, these types of things all occur at. So then that allowed us to, once we really understood the physiology, to develop simple self-regulation techniques. In other words, techniques that allow us to really maintain our composure in the heat of the moment. And that our founder, Doc Childrey, was very instrumental in helping us scientific types keep it simple for people. So this has led now to a whole series of techniques that can be taught in different ways, but basically the same essence based on the understanding of the physiology, from kindergartners all the way to corporate executives and generals in the military and so on. So I'll pause there if you have any comments or questions or objections.
This is objections. No, this is all amazing stuff, and again I still have to go back to that point of the heart being so powerful in just communicating to all points of the body. And what I found interesting, and this tiny bit off topic, but I remember you were saying at the lecture I attended, the heart signaling just affecting the brain centers that have to deal with like strategic thinking, reaction time, self-regulation. And this is all stuff that if you're not paying attention to the heart, if you're not aware of your heart and you think you're just a mind-brain thing happening, you can get into some trouble, it seems like.
Well, right. So here's a kind of a classic example, I think, Craig, of what you might be talking about. If you've ever been, I encourage your listeners to think about this too, in a situation where you were talking with, it could be your spouse or somebody that you're close to, or if you have teenagers, you can probably relate. But there you are talking away, and they say something or do something that just frustrates you. You get a little angry or a little irritated at them, and then you find yourself blurting something out that you really didn't mean. Obviously, you didn't think about it. And about 30 seconds later, you're asking yourself, God, where was my brain? I can't believe the mess I just made. Have you ever had that experience?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And then I kind of jokingly will ask audiences if I'm doing a lecture, well, how many of you have done that with the same person around the same issue more than once?
Yep.
Right? That usually gets a pretty good laugh because we've all done that, right? Yep. So what I've been describing is really the physiology of what's going on. So when we feel those, and by the way, stress, stress is a safe word, but stress is almost always an emotional response. It's if we really name what makes up stress, it is things like frustration and irritation and impatience, feeling overwhelmed and so on. It's emotions. So when we feel that trigger, we get that trigger, right? We get that frustration going or that impatience, like in that communication I was talking about. That creates this incoherence in our physiology, and that's reflected in our heart rhythms, these very chaotic-looking patterns. So I'll give you a little more physiology here. I don't want to make this too much of a science talk, but it took a lot of people a lot of years to sort this all out. But at the end of the day, it's really quite simple. So we have all this neural information being sent from the heart up to the brain, and lots of it, right? In fact, the nerves that can go from the brain to the body, the primary nerves are called the vagus nerves. 90% of those neural fibers, these are two very big nerves, thousands of fibers in each one. 90% of those are carrying information from the body back to the brain, right? And the vast majority of those come from the heart and cardiovascular system. So when we talk about the brain, being in control, that's only 10% of the nervous system. 90% is what's coming back into the brain. But anyway, when we get frustrated, those neural signals coming up those nerve pathways are that incoherent pattern, that stop, jerky looking rhythm. Stop go is what I meant to say, herky-jerky looking rhythm. Well, those neural signals are going directly to the very core of our brain, a part of the brain called the thalamus. It's the very center of our brain. We only have one thalamus. We have two of almost everything, but not the thalamus. It has a lot of important roles. And one of those is that it synchronizes the electrical activity of all the neurons in our brain, especially the frontal centers and what we were talking about earlier. And so when those rhythms are hitting it, those incoherent rhythms, that underlies what was the observation for this effect back in the 70s called cortical inhibition that I mentioned earlier. This is the mechanism of it. So the neurons in our brain have to be in sync for information to flow through our senses and be perceived and these types of things. So when we're in that incoherent state, basically all the neurons in our cortex are not very well synchronized. So that it's the neural machinery that underlies our thinking ability and our ability to self-regulate are out of sync. Well, those functions are taken offline. And that's why we blurt out the thing, right? We say the thing we regret later, because we're now reacting from our subcortical kind of centers that aren't very well reasoned or thought out or considered. We don't look at that foresight capacity. Well, how is what I'm going to say going to affect the other person in my future, right? That's all taken offline. So if we're able to pause and shift into a coherent rhythm, well, that facilitates cortical synchronization at the level of the thalamus. So our neurons are more in sync. So it actually improves our performance above our normal walking around states even. Reaction times, as you mentioned, things like that. And I might have gotten off topic a little bit there. I'm not sure, Craig, where we were headed, but that's kind of the mechanism that explains that.
No, I think it's brilliant what you're saying, and it's such a no pun intended, mind-altering kind of a view to hear this information about the heart because it's not being talked about.
Right. Well, let me see if I can blow your mind a little bit more.
Right.
So that was a lot of years of our research was really understanding the basic anatomy, the functions, the neural connections, and because everything I just explained, this is basic anatomy, really, even though a lot of it wouldn't be taught in high school, but this is all very well-established stuff, and a lot of people have done work on this over the years to establish all these neural pathways and functions I've been talking about. Where it got a little more creative, I think, for us, well, let me back up a little bit before I explain this series of experiments, but once people learned these HeartMarth techniques that you're able to get your heart rhythm into this coherent rhythm at will through these simple techniques, people started practicing that, so they're becoming more basically self-regulated. They're maintaining their composure is a more simple way to say that, but especially in those more stressful times. But one of the things that I most commonly heard from people who were using these techniques, and sticking with it for a while, was that their intuition was greatly enhanced, and more synchronicities were occurring in their life. And it was not a subtle thing. Just a big jump in intuition and synchronicities was going on. So I heard this from many, many people, and my own experience as well. And many of us here at HeartMarth. And a guy named Dean Radin, you might know him. Dean's a senior scientist up at the Institute of Noetic Science. I'm going back into probably the late 90s, mid to late 90s now. Was visiting our lab and was telling us about an experiment that he had done. It wasn't published yet, but that it basically showed that a person's autonomic nervous system would respond before a future event, and explains the protocol of how they did this. I don't know if you know that work or not, but
yeah, I think you talked about that. This is really fascinating.
So we said, okay, this is neat. A neat protocol. It basically involved showing pictures, randomly selected pictures, and these are pictures from what's called the International Affective Picture Set. In other words, it's a group of photos that have been well-researched to know the types of emotions they tend to evoke when people see them and how strong the emotions are that they evoke. So basically we use pictures from that, as Dean had. So you take the two extreme opposite ends of those photos, the ones that really evoke a strong emotional reaction. So these would be photos of like a snake striking at the screen, very realistic photos, or an auto accident with blood and gore, or a bad guy with a knife at a woman's throat, with a mean look on his face, things like that. Excuse me. Or on the other end, you've got bunny rabbits and flowers and nature scenes and things like that, a calming type. Now, the way the experiment worked was that you're monitoring the person's physiology, and in Dean's case, he was measuring skin conductance. And what he found was that changes in the person's skin conductance were, before you saw the picture, were consistent with what the future picture was going to be. Now, a key understanding here is that the photographs are randomly selected by a true random device after the data has already been collected. So nobody can possibly know what the future image is going to be. The computer doesn't even know yet. Okay? You with me? So we said we thought this could be a pretty neat way of probing a type of intuition. And we classify intuition into 3 different major types, by the way, that helps understand this. We can come back to that if you want. But so we added a lot of other physiological measures other than the skin conductance. We looked at EEGs, the brainwave activity, the heart, obviously, some other potential measures in the body that I don't need to complicate things with here. But we did that, kind of put a lot of thought into it, so we designed the experiments to see if we could really track the flow of intuitive, what I call intuitive information, through the body, mind, brain, nervous system, wherever that might be happening. And by all these measures and some other sophisticated signal processing things and stuff that we have the capability to do. So anyway, long story short, we did this experiment with 30 people, and we did it twice with the same group. It was. I won't go into all the details. That's not really necessary here, but a very well thought out experiment where basically in a randomized way, the people went through. The first time the experiment, they did what's called a heart lock-in. This is one of the HeartMarth techniques. But basically, you get into that coherent heart state for 10 minutes before they went through the experimental protocol. And then they also went through it in their normal state. They came into the lab. We were nice to them and all, but they didn't get coherent first. And the results were, I couldn't have dreamed that if I had, kind of written ahead of time what I wanted the results to be, it wouldn't have been as good as what we actually found. And there was so much out of the study, it had to be published in 2 separate publications. In fact, it was just too long to fit in one journal paper. So I'm just going to round off a little bit here, some of the main findings, if I may. And first of all, what we found was that the activity of the heart HRV, in what we'll call the pre-stimulus period, that means before you see the photograph, was far better at predicting the future picture than the skin conductance was. And that's been confirmed in study after study now. The heart's the ones that's the most predictive of the future outcome. That was one finding, which was pretty amazing, all right, to begin with. Then we found that the rhythms of the heart were shifting before there was any measurable activity in the brain in the pre-stimulus period. So we did another analysis called heartbeat evoke potential analysis, which allows you to literally trace the flow of neural information coming up the nervous system from the heart to the brain and how it flows through the different brain centers, both in time and location. We're able to map that out with great accuracy. And what the study found was that wherever this intuition comes from for a moment, the heart gets it first. The heart then literally sends a different neural signal to the brain, primarily to the frontal cortex. Then you get a measurable brain response, all pre-stimulus. Then you get responses that then go back down to the body, so you feel it in the gut or the hair on the back of your neck, people talk about. But the real flow of information is heart, brain, body. And then if you're paying attention, you have that feeling, right? Because intuition for most people is described as a feeling. I had that feeling about I shouldn't do this, or it just felt right, like an entrepreneur's when they make business decisions and so on. Now, the other thing that the study showed very clearly was that when you're in the coherent state before going through the protocol, the signals were let me just say it in a simple way, were much clearer, much stronger signals getting to the frontal cortex. So people seem to have more access to the intuitive information by being in a coherent state. So I'll pause there and see if you have any comments or questions on that line of research.
I just think that's the most incredible study I've ever heard of before. It's the heart was predicting the photo before the mind saw it or the heart saw it. That is so. Forget the term science fiction. That's almost time travel-y kind of stuff.
Well, it is time travel-y, and there have been a lot of studies now along these lines. A lot of the mainstream people don't like them, but there's so many of them now. There's even 2 different meta-analyses of these types of studies. So it's all by independent, and this is something that's been able to be independently replicated in multiple labs by multiple investigators. So this is past just some, quirky mistake thing. And these kind of experiments are extremely well thought out, because when you know, kind of a well-known saying here is when you're making these kind of, claims or findings, the rigor of the experiments have got to go way above and beyond the call of duty, so to speak. So the way I got that published at that time was to, in a peer-reviewed journal, right? And I think we were the first to ever publish any of this. Well, not the first, but this particular kind of work was that it appears that the heart and brain appear to have access to a field of information that is not limited by the boundaries of time and space. Now, that was perfectly acceptable language for a scientific journal, because at that time, things like non-locality and entanglement had been clearly proven in quantum physics. But at that time, it was only supposed to happen at subatomic levels, below the level of the, within the atom kinds of things. Now, since then, this has been demonstrated at macroscopic scales in quantum physics, with not only whole atoms, even groups of atoms and things. But we were plussing data at that time showing, no, this is happening at the whole organ scales. That's not such a big deal now, because it's been shown in quantum physics to occur as well. So what I really meant, that was kind of code for my way of thinking, Craig, is, so what is a field of information anyway, not bound by time and space? Well, actually, by definition, when we talk about frequency domain, Carl Pribram, a very famous neuroscientist, who's actually credited with the whole field of modern cognitive neuroscience for creating that field, he was one of my mentors, and I learned a lot from Carl, but he very clearly makes a point. Once you're into the frequency domain, you're out of time and space. You're processing in the energetic environment. Now, it's a little complicated, and I'm sorry if I'm getting too complex here, but what I meant by that, to make back to my point, was what for millennia has been called either the energetic heart or the spiritual heart, which is the frequency, the energetic side of all this. So that basically, I'm just really suggesting here that our heart, physical heart, is coupled to the energetic level, the energetic heart, and that's really the primary connection point to, and every culture has their own name, and different people prefer to call it different things, but higher self, soul, spirit, higher capacities, whatever. But that David Bohm called it our undivided wholeness, which he called the implicate order, but saying exactly the same thing. The energetic domain that gives structure to and really creates the physical world. So I think this is some neat evidence kind of suggesting that a lot of the great philosophers and spiritual icons of our world have been right all along, because they've all talked about this in their own way, but all saying the same thing. I have some fascinating stories about that if we have time, or another time we can talk about. So after that, we went on to develop some different protocols for this, using not using photographs, but using a roulette type thing. Now, let me go back and say that in that particular protocol, the information before the future picture was about just under 6 seconds before you saw the picture. But that was I will say, an artifact or a limitation, or because of the experimental protocol, because that was the only time. The time window was 6 seconds before the future picture. In the new protocol we designed, we had 2 pre-stimulus periods. In this case, it was one before you made your bet, we could see what was happening, and one after, but before you knew the result. So in those experiments, the pre-stimulus response was happening 20 seconds before you knew the outcome, because we had a longer period to look at that in. So, and we all know that in the real life, we get intuitions because it could be long before an event occurs, or these unknown things. So now that protocol has been used in a number of different labs, and including with groups of entrepreneurs and college students and things. And consistently, the heart proves to be the best signal predicting the unknown future outcome.
Yeah, that's just amazing stuff, and some of the things that and just what you've said in the last half an hour or so. It's kind of a self-contained unit, our heart and brain and body, but this is actually kind of a universal thing, because even the Earth's magnetic field can affect the heart.
Right. So
not to go too macro on you, but
now let's go there, because we've already been talking about within ourselves now and what coherence means. So let me build to that by saying we've also done a series of experiments. This is published in papers and chapters and things as well for interested readers. They can find this on our website. Download these chapters and papers for free at heartmath.org and in our research library. But the heart also creates the largest rhythmic magnetic field produced in the body. And I made clear, I'm not talking about an aura here. This is something that we can measure with scientific equipment. So when you put electrodes on the body to measure the electrocardiogram or the EEG or the brain waves, what you're measuring is current flow. It's electricity. But whenever we have a flow of electrical current, we also create a magnetic field. It's a fundamental law of electromagnetics. That's why it's called electromagnetism. But electric fields and magnetic fields are two completely different things. It's just called electromagnetism because you make one out of the other, and they tend to be coupled. Whenever one's moving, you make the other. So when the heart beats, it generates a magnetic field, and one of the things about magnetic fields is they penetrate things. They go through walls and what have you. That's why a cell phone will work inside of a building. It's the magnetic component of the electromagnetic field that does that. So in fact, I'm talking about exactly the same kind of magnetic field that your cell phone creates to send the signal, right?
Right.
Okay. And same equipment to measure it, in fact. So with today's equipment, we can measure the magnetic field of the heart about 3 feet away from the body. Okay, you can measure a brain wave about an inch away using the same equipment at the same sensitivity settings. So it doesn't mean that the heart's field ends at 3 feet. That's just the sensitivity of the equipment. A few years ago, you could only measure 2 feet away, right? So it's right. Out of the sensitivity.
And it's kind of mind-blowing that an inch to 3 feet that's pretty huge.
Yeah. So that's done. That's definitely doable with today's equipment. So what we were able to then also show is that the magnetic field is like a carrier wave that's carrying especially information about our emotional state. And we can use spectral analysis, things like this, to decode and see those different patterns. And now the way to think of this is back to our cell phone analogy. You create a carrier wave, right, from how your phone talks to the cell tower, or any radio, TV transmitter. It all works the same way. So the carrier wave is the carrier of the information, the photo, the text message, the voice, whatever. We just modulate the field with. If you're familiar with radios, it's called AM and FM modulation, that kind of thing. And there's other types of modulation as well. Well, it's a great analogy because basically the heart's doing the same thing. The field produced by the heart is carrying that information. So we were able to show that and do these different spectral analyses and show that different states were reflected, emotional states were being reflected in or carrying this information. So the next step was asking the question, we know that we're radiating it. Are we able to detect it from other people? And that was actually a whole other set of experiments. It worked really well, better than they should have probably. And we've been able to show even 5 feet apart, several feet farther than a $50,000 magnetometer can measure the field, that we're able to detect and respond to the information from other people's heart fields, cardiac fields. And synchronize with each other, and a lot of really neat things. I won't go into the details here because of time, but basically that was a whole other line of research that gets quoted a lot out there now these days. And it really explains or gives rigorous science to what most everybody, I think, has experienced at one time or another in their life. That you can actually sense other people, the presence of other people, even though you may not hear them or see them. When somebody's staring at you, sometimes you can feel that, and in fact, experiments have been done by other groups that actually showed that actually is real. Or that you can just sort of tell sometimes when somebody's had a bad day, or it's not in a happy state, right? Maybe got a phone call with some bad news or something. You can feel it even before you get cues from their body language or tone of voice and these types of things. And other people, it just feels really good to be around sometimes. Makes sense, Craig?
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah, I think we've all had
yeah.
that. Somebody comes into the meeting or the party, and they're the life of the party, or they bring the whole thing down.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, some people are upset and they want you to know it and you to feel the same way, right? But as we learn to maintain our own personal coherence, though, what these experiments have also shown is we don't have to be as affected by those not so kind energies, and they literally are energies or vibrations, if you want to use that term. I prefer not to, but that are going on. So you mentioned the Earth. I wanted to give that background because most people can get how that's going on in our local environment, right, between people and things. As it turns out, the Earth's doing very similar. At least that's our hypothesis. So we formed or created what's now called the Global Coherence Initiative. And this, without any marketing, this has got over 150,000 kind of members and followers now that are participating. So we're really looking, it's really the science of the interconnectivity between humanity or humans and the Earth's fields. And some really absolutely fascinating findings, again, are coming out of this, past what I would have imagined possible. I've learned, one thing I can tell you, Craig, I've learned as a scientist to not try and predetermine what the outcomes are going to be. Because they usually, a lot of times, they come out better than what you could have imagined. So it's really to be neutral there and just really follow the data. And there's been a few times in my career where we've had that happen, and what we're seeing now with the Global Coherence Initiative data is another one of those. That's just blow away. I mean, just not what we would ever expected to have found. But anyway, let me go back to the gist here. So part of the to do research on this, we have to obviously measure things. So we've been installing a global network of ultra-sensitive magnetometers around the Earth. It's called the Global Coherence Monitoring System. And it's the first network, time-synced network of these magnetometers that's ever been done. So these are very different magnetometers than what NOAA uses, for the space, for magnetic field disturbance and things. And because they're designed to measure the resonant frequencies in the Earth's fields. And there's a couple different kinds these things are tuned into. I wish we didn't have to do this ourselves. It'd be a lot easier if the network already existed. And I think we're one of the few groups that's actually looking at how the effects, these field effects, Earth fields in this case, are interacting with and affecting humanity, and our hypothesis vice versa. So we have sites now in, we've got one here at our property here in Northern California, I guess technically Central California, and Canada, New Zealand, Lithuania, Saudi Arabia, and one going actually in about a month, about 6 weeks from now in South Africa. And I'm probably missing one. But so we're trying to get this global view of Earth's energetic systems and magnetic fields. And just to give you a little idea what I'm talking about here, if you, do you remember, Craig, I think for me it was like 8th, 9th grade, somewhere in there, and we got to play with iron filings and magnets in science class.
Oh, yeah. My son was just doing that a while ago, yeah.
Yeah, isn't that fun?
Yeah.
And you move it around. But basically, when you dump your iron filings, you stick a magnet under a glass plate, or you can do it in your hand. The magnetic fields go right through your hand. You can prove that magnetic fields go through human tissues that way, too, very easily. But anyway, they all jump into these patterns, right? The shape of the magnetic field. But the iron filings organize themselves in lines, right? Remember that experiment?
Yes.
Those are called flux lines. And the geomagnetic field of the Earth is exactly the same way. It's a big donut or a torus shape, big figure 8 basically around the Earth. Of course, the Earth's magnetic field radiates out into space many hundreds of thousands of miles, and it's absolutely critical for life on Earth. With no magnetic field, Earth would look like Mars very quickly. So it protects us from the solar wind and cosmic radiations and so on. By far our first line of defense there. So the Earth's field is like, you could think of it metaphorically as a big bar magnet, like a refrigerator magnet, right? Like we did in the science experiments. It's a pure magnetic field. There's no electric field involved when you've got a permanent magnet like that. So anyway, this is, of course, the geomagnetic field's what our compasses tune into, right? It's how we know north and south and all that. But it's a static field or stationary, just like those magnets. The strength of the field really isn't changing relative to our day-to-day lives. I mean, yes, the magnitude of the strength changes over hundreds of thousands of years, thousands to hundreds of thousands of years, but for our day-to-day lives, it's always the same. But think of those flux lines in the Earth's magnetic field as guitar strings, okay? And what happens when you pluck a guitar string, right? Vibrates, doesn't it? It has a note, a frequency. And it turns out that's exactly what's going on with the Earth's flux lines. And what's plucking the strings, if you will, is the solar wind. Now, the solar wind is I'll use a scientific term here, the stuff that's blown out from the sun. These are highly charged protons and clouds of plasma and these types of things. This is different than the photons that we see day and night from. And these staggering amounts of the stuff that's blown out. So the solar wind, that's what creates the solar wind. And on a quiet day, the solar wind is traveling about 1 million miles per hour. And it's strong enough, the pressure of the solar wind pushes the magnetic field of the Earth in on the daytime side and stretches it out on the nighttime side. Probably remember this from, high school science class. At least I learned it and forgot it and had to relearn it here. But meanwhile, the Earth is turning in the solar wind, and the sun's also turning and rotating. So there are these complex interactions that go on. And as the solar wind is rushing by, it's plucking the strings of the Earth. And their resonant mode, the notes, and they can change depending upon how much pressure, which changes as the sun changes. But the resonant frequencies of these notes, and the technical term, by the way, for this is called structural field line resonances. But the vibrations, one of the key modes that we see from our magnetometers, is exactly the same frequency as a human coherent heart rhythm. And all of them are in the same range as our cardiovascular system and the rhythms in our autonomic nervous system. Okay?
Oh.
Hope that you
yeah, that
has some impact on most people when they hear that. So Earth is vibrating away as the same frequency as our hearts and nervous system's activity. Now, there's also a second magnetic system, and I'll try and say this a little quicker, and that has to do with the interaction between the Earth and the ionosphere. So for the listeners who aren't familiar with the ionosphere, you can think of it as a big soap bubble around planet Earth. And it starts about 50 miles up from the surface of the Earth and goes out to about 100 to 150 miles. And it's also important for life on Earth. And it's a highly ionized layer of plasma, as it's called. The bottom of it's basically the ozone layer, more or less. And so it stops cosmic rays and all these different things. But you can think of the ionosphere as basically the bottom of it as being a mirror or a reflector of magnetic waves, lower frequency magnetic waves. In fact, this is why ham radio operators are successful in talking to somebody in the United States, talking to somebody in England or China or something like that, because you send your radio wave up and it hits the ionosphere and bounces off and goes over, to somebody on the other side of the planet. And if you get two bounces, which can happen sometimes, you're really lucky. You talk to somebody in Australia or South Africa or something, right? But the point here is that magnetic waves get created in this cavity between the ionosphere and the Earth become what are called globally propagating standing waves. Let me translate that. It means they're everywhere, all the time. And those are called Schumann resonances. There's 8 of them. The first one is 7.8 hertz. So it's a much faster rhythm than the field line resonances I was talking about. But those overlap our brainwave frequencies. So planet Earth is singing away at the same rhythm as our hearts and brains. So you might also go back to high school physics and science class when we got to play with tuning forks to demonstrate the principle of resonance. It's like you bang a tuning fork or pluck a guitar string, doesn't matter. In another system that's tuned to the same frequency starts to vibrate in unison with it. So in that case, air molecules transmit the energy between them, but it's a fun way to demonstrate that when systems are resonant or operating at the same frequency, you can transfer energy and information between them. So basically what I just said is humanity, our brains and hearts are vibrating exactly the same frequency as Earth's resonant frequencies. So we have the opportunity there to transfer energy and information. So I know we're running short on time here, but basically what we're finding is that we're by measuring people's nervous system activity over long time periods, like 5 months and 30 days at a time in groups of people, is that we are far more interconnected with the Earth's fields than we ever imagined to be true at a far deeper and more fundamental level than we thought would be possible. In fact, we're getting ready to submit a paper to Nature on this because it's so profound what we're seeing here. And we just completed a new study here that had groups of people in 5 countries, actually, in New Zealand and Saudi Arabia and here in California and England and Lithuania, where we have sites, all doing long-term recordings at the same time. And we hope to see there, we just finished the data collection last week, actually, that we will see a global synchronization between people happening, because we've certainly shown that now in local group areas. I know that probably wasn't clear, but it's a fairly complex thing to explain.
Right.
But the take-home message here is we're far more interconnected with each other and the Earth itself at this energetic level than we ever imagined possible.
Well, you've laid some heavy stuff out on us about the heart and just interconnected with, not just other people, but with the world, our planet, the universe itself. How can we utilize this in daily life? I hate to say the real world, but how do we bring this back down to, me waking up in the morning and what do I do with all this stuff?
Great question, Craig. Because really, fundamentally, what HeartMath is about is providing people with really simple, practical, effective tools to be able to better self-regulate themselves, to be able to maintain their composure in their energetic environment, personal energetic environment. So some of the stuff I was just talking about, when the Earth's fields are disturbed, that can have the impact that has on humanity. A couple studies showing this now is that we're edgier. We have less energy, more mentally confused and fogged and so on because of the energetic environment. But we're using these techniques, we can maintain our own personal coherence anyway. We don't have to be as affected by that. But the other thing that our research is hoping to show anyway, I can't say we've proven this yet, but one of our hypotheses is that the Earth's magnetic field, just like our own local heart's magnetic field, is a carrier of biologically relevant information. So especially when we're in a personally coherent state, what we're suggesting here is we're more able to couple to the larger Earth field. So one of the, I wish I had slides I could show your listeners here because that's a whole story in its own right, how we couple to that field. But basically what I ask people to do at the end of the day, or even better in each moment of the day, is ask themselves, what am I feeding the field, right now? Is it kindness and compassion for my coworkers, my family, people I'm interacting with? Or am I feeding the field frustration and irritation because my to-do list isn't getting done quick enough? So what I'm suggesting here is that all counts, and it all contributes to a global information field. Right? So one of the very practical things I think we can all do is become more responsible for what we're feeding the field, becoming more loving, caring, compassionate individuals in our day-to-day interactions. And what HeartMath is about is giving people simple tools and practices to be able to do that more quickly and more effectively.
Well, Rollin, we're getting to the top of the hour, and I so appreciate your time. You mentioned earlier heartmath.org, and that site is so wonderful because there's just so much to look at. There's hours of fascinating stuff to read and to look at, and I just wonder if there's any specific thing people should go to first when they go to heartmath.org, or.
Well, it depends on their interest. We're actually launching a new site this week, so I hope people will enjoy. There's options to become a trainer in HeartMath if you want to learn the skills and teach them to others. There's several options there for different tracks for healthcare professionals or people that want to become coaches and mentors or professional trainers for delivering our programs to companies and staff and public talks and present workshops and things. Or there's a lot of free resources there as well. We also have a technology that helps people measure their own heart rate variability and how coherent they are, and help that they can use when they're using the techniques to train themselves to be more coherent. That's called the M-Wave or Inner Balance. Inner Balance is the one for iPhones and iPads, iOS devices. So there's a lot of ways, and I'd also encourage your listeners to maybe join the Global Coherence Initiative, which you can also get through the IHM, the HeartMath.org site as well, and get involved in helping create a more coherent planet Earth.
Yeah. Well, I hope everybody, if you ever have the opportunity to see Rollin McCraty live and do a lecture and have the full slideshow and video presentation and stuff, it's actually just absolutely fascinating. It's a lot more stuff than you can just fit into a 55-minute interview. But go to heartmath.org. There's so much to look at and so much fascinating stuff to learn about. And Rollin, I just so appreciate your time because I know you're so busy, and I appreciate you giving us a new look at what our heart can actually do and how it can connect to the entire world.
Thank you, Craig. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with your listeners, and I hope they found our time together today interesting, at least, and if not motivating, to maybe go check some of this out and learn some of the HeartMath techniques to help improve their own health, well-being, or performance, whatever their goals are in life.
Rollin, thank you so much, and definitely would love to have you back sometime.
I'd be happy to be back at some point.
Bye.
All right, take care.
Okay.